Hello, fellow peacemakers. Welcome back to episode 43 of Make Peace Not Beef. This is Lily, of course, your favorite host, hopefully. So, I know I took a brief break from podcasting. Actually, I didn't take a break, but it's been a while since I've released episodes, and there was a full month in between in which I didn't release any episodes. Actually, because my virtual assistant, Veronica, she was gravely ill and in the hospital. So for a whole month or so, I debated if I should edit those episodes myself and release them, or if I should wait until she recovers to let her do the edits. And it was just, it was a difficult time for my virtual assistant and her family and also myself. So yeah, I really apologize for the delay in the episode release, but I'm back and I'm still committed. And I do have many episodes planned in the future. So no, I am still very much actively involved with Make Peace Not Beef and the production. So yeah, it's just that due to technical difficulties and also I guess unforeseen circumstances, we had to take a brief break. So I thank you for your patience. But yes, we're back. We're back on track. So I also just want to thank Veronica for her quick turnaround, and I'm glad that she's fully recovered now from a terrible case of measles. Yeah, so actually today, for the first time, I'm doing an unscripted episode. So if you don't know me, I am an absolute control freak and I absolutely suck at any form of improvisation. So in the past, all my solo episodes have been fully scripted, believe it or not. Yes, including those 15-minute episodes. I literally typed it out on a computer word by word and then I would read it, because me being someone who is controlling, I would say, I just don't feel comfortable leaving anything up to chance. It makes me very nervous not knowing that there's a possibility that I might be stumped or I might run out of things to talk about. So that just makes me panic, especially when I start recording. So normally I write a full script, but today I want to challenge myself. I want to push myself out of my comfort zone. I want to do what most podcasters in the world do, which is to have a few talking points and not actually write out word by word and then read it verbatim. I'm gonna wing it. So I might suck at this, and I appreciate you being the guinea pigs for my experiment. I've never done an unscripted episode, so I've never done an unscripted solo episode. Obviously it's not scripted with guests, so here we go. So if you look at the title of this episode, it says, I'm still vegan, but ... So I was originally going to name this episode my evolving stance on veganism. I've been a vegan for a little bit over a year, and this past year, my stance on veganism has definitely evolved and changed, as I talked about, and a lot of things, when I first started, a year later, I look back, I realized that a lot of my views have shifted a little bit, and I hope to discuss that with you today. It's a very nuanced discussion, so I really appreciate you tuning in, and I hope that I can have an opportunity to talk about what it means to me today to be a vegan. But before that, I first want to talk about COP26, which, because of the delay in my episode release, I didn't get a chance to cover COP26 in a previous episode. I was supposed to do an episode on it, but it's a month after. But anyway, so COP26, which is the 26th United Nations Conference on Climate Change, took place this year in Glasgow, Scotland, at the beginning of November. And the conference was about 2 weeks, where world leaders congregated to talk about net zero goals and how they're going to achieve the terms laid out in the Paris Agreement, in which, every nation was held accountable for some sort of emission reduction target so that we can keep the planet's temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. That's the whole goal of it. So the conference took place for 2 weeks. And of course, you're like bombarded with news about COP26 in the media, and all the major media outlets were reporting, providing day-by-day updates on the conference. And I think compared to all the previous COPs, I would say COP26 was relatively successful. Now, I know critics are going to say, this is yet another, political stunt, an utter failure. Nothing was done. But I would say there were actually quite a few milestones achieved in this conference. So let's start with the pledges. Let's talk about what was actually achieved, right? So over 100 countries at COP26 pledged to end deforestation by 2030. That's the first thing. Now, the second thing is over 100 countries agreed to cut methane by 30% by 2030. And also private financial institutions with combined assets valued over 130 trillion US dollars have decided to join forces to invest in clean technology to help the transition to a post-carbon world and to achieve net zero goals. So, the private sector finally stepped up their game. And for the first time, I think this is the first COP in which world leaders finally discussed coal and its negative impact on the environment. So they agreed to, the wording they use is phase down instead of phase out of coal. So the wording there could have been a little bit more aggressive, but for the first time they did talk about tangible targets to reduce the usage of coal. And then many other nations discussed cutting subsidies for fossil fuel. This came as a surprise to me, like, come on, are we still funding the fossil fuel industry at this point? So yeah, and also, of course, how can I forget, India pledged to become net zero by 2070. I know it seems like a long time from now, but given India's current infrastructure, this is actually quite an ambitious goal. Now, here's the thing to keep in mind. Even with the COP26, all the pledges and all the targets, even if we're on track to meeting these targets, the reality is that we're still on track to reach 2.4 degrees of rising global temperatures. Despite all the pledges being made at COP26, this is where we're headed. So we're nowhere close to 1.5, right? So if we somehow fulfill all the targets, we're still going to see a global temperature rise of 2.4 degrees, which is very, very concerning. Like, 1.5 degrees Celsius is already not a desirable state, right? But we're at 2.4 right now, which means there's a lot more that needs to be done, and we need to act a lot more aggressively. And I'm not the kind of person that likes to talk about the problem. I want to discuss the solution, which is why I created Make Peace Not Beef, because I spent a big part of my life, having these discussions with environmentalists, climate activists, and I just feel like the bulk of the conversation was always focused on the magnitude of the problem and the political expediency and how politicians are not doing enough. And yet I feel like goddamn, we spent hours and hours talking about things like we're going in circle, but we're not really talking about the solution, which is why I decided to become a vegan. Also, to reduce animal cruelty, but the environmental factor was undeniably a big driver behind my decision, because I wanted to do something tangible to solve the crisis and not just talk about how sluggish our governments are when it comes to enacting climate policies. Okay, so today I want to sort of bring the conversation back to myself, like at an individual level, me as a vegan. And I've been thinking about it for the past year, like how can I maximize my impact as a vegan and spreading the message. Now, if you've been following my podcast, we're coming close to a year, right? I started in the beginning of January and now we're at December. So I became a vegan October 2020. So a little bit over a year now. And the first 2 months I was like full throttle. I don't get me wrong, I am still a vegan and I'm going to explain it in a second. But I was just so adamant about spreading the message, and I wanted everyone on the planet to go vegan with me, and I was just so determined, and that's why I created Make Peace Not Beef, because I really believe in the message behind veganism and the philosophy and the way of life. And I still do. Okay, I want to clarify that I still do. But after being a vegan for a year and navigating different social circumstances, and not to say that I've buckled under pressure, because by no means, I still stand behind veganism. I still am a vegan. But there are some things in which I would like to opt out of. And specifically, it's this kind of stringent mentality, this very exclusionary. Look, I don't want to, you know what? I don't want to like apply a group mentality to vegan and say the vegan community is like this, but I do feel like there is this tacit, unspoken but understood culture within veganism that the moment you become a vegan, you are now under the watchful eye of every other vegan. And if you do something slightly wrong, I just feel like I was going to be judged, or I would be disowned from the vegan community, or I would be written off as a traitor, or it was just tremendous pressure. And not even from meat eaters, right? But also, also from like my friends who still eat meat. I feel like I'm just being watched and judged. Like I have to be perfect, because the moment I am slightly imperfect, I can no longer call myself a vegan. And so living with that kind of pressure, I have to admit, was just too much. And so today I want to talk about why I decided to become more of a flexible vegan, to really broaden my impact and reach with my work, and what I do with Make Peace Not Beef. So before you get mad at me, and like for my listeners who are vegans, first of all, I want to say I respect you, I applaud you, and I'm still with you, and I still stand behind the community. But it's just that I'm not sure if I'm still allowed to call myself a vegan if I tell you I'm not a vegan 100% of the time. And that was one of my biggest fears, because I felt like the moment I started identifying as a vegan, like everywhere I go, if I tell people I'm a vegan, I am going to be judged or wrong if I do something that isn't 100% compliant with the vegan philosophy. So I'll give you an example, right? Like nowadays when I shoot a video, like, and the video, like, I remember in one of my previous videos, like I wore a leather jacket, and then I was gonna edit and post a video, and I was like, shit, but if I post this video, like, I'm pretty sure my fellow vegans are going to question me and challenge me and ask me, why did I wear a leather jacket in a video? Things like that. Like, these are things I think about before I create content. Now, that leather jacket, mind you, I bought it before I became a vegan, and I haven't owned or bought any leather after I became a vegan. I did buy a wool jacket by mistake, because I just feel like there's various stages of veganism, and I'm not perfect. And I'm still learning, like, what's vegan and what's not, right? Like, soon after I became a vegan, I learned honey is not vegan. Okay, so I stopped eating honey. But at some point, I'm going to err and make mistakes, because I am human. And there's not like a vegan Bible that kind of lists everything that a vegan is not supposed to do. But I did feel compelled to learn and to, like, fact check myself and live this, like, super, super strict lifestyle where with a super strict regimen, like with the highest standards of ethics. I just felt like I had to adhere to that in order to call myself a vegan, and it was, I'm not going to lie, it is a lot of pressure, and I'm not sure if other vegans feel this way. And in the past few months, I've been very active on Clubhouse, right? For those of you who didn't know, Clubhouse is this booming audio app that was born during the pandemic. And I'm so grateful for Clubhouse. I met so many amazing people, friends, mentors. I've built a community there. I've really broadened my network. It's just been a phenomenal experience, and I still use Clubhouse from time to time. I am a big fan of Clubhouse. And at the same time, I also join many vegan communities on Clubhouse. And I was able to talk to fellow vegans, and they really welcomed me to the community. And I learned so much from people who have been vegan for a much, much longer time than me. And it was really eye-opening to hear their experience, how they navigate the social circumstances of veganism and things like that. But at some point, it almost felt like an echo chamber to me where the vegans were talking to each other. So every time I go on Clubhouse, like I would be pinged into these rooms that were started by vegans, and then we would talk about like veganism as a way of life and things like that. But it was like among ourselves as vegans. And then I would hop into these other rooms, like climate change related rooms. Like that's like the environmentalist in me. So I was kind of like in this dual role as like a vegan activist and also as an environmental activist. And when I went into those like environmentalist groups, a lot of environmentalists still ate meat. And then I had vegan friends join those groups and challenge their stance on eating meat. And I was fully with that too. I am like, well, if you're truly a climate activist, can you truly be a climate activist and still eat meat? But knowing that animal agriculture is a principal contributor to climate change, right? Like I also challenged them. But over time, I slowly found myself taking more and more of the stance that I want to educate people on animal agriculture, also the cruelty behind it and also the environmental impact behind it. But ultimately, I do respect that it is a personal choice. And I actually think that I am able to broaden my impact and reach if I were to be less radical and more relatable as a human being first and foremost when spreading my philosophy of veganism. So, which brings me to my next point, which is that I decided that because we live in an imperfect world, I cannot possibly be a perfect vegan. And so I cannot guarantee that I can be 100% vegan going forward at this point. I think it would be closer to something like I'll be like 90 to 95% vegan, which means at home, whenever I can, I would definitely cook vegan food. I will not buy leather. I will still do all those things. But if I were to go out and socialize with friends and families and things like that, and I don't like, if I was in a situation in which vegan food was not a viable option, I wouldn't go out of my way to inconvenience the restaurant unless it's like removing an ingredient or so, like I'll do that. But if there were no vegan options, I think I would just go with the best option, right? Whether it's vegetarian or not. I still wouldn't eat meat because I'm pretty sure it's possible to find vegetarian options still at restaurants. But if they truly had no vegan option whatsoever, like I think I would be okay to eat eggs and dairy once in a while, like if that was all the option that I had. Now, if there were vegan options, of course I'd go with that. But I've decided that as a vegan and as a climate activist, I think I would be able to scale my impact much more quicker and more effectively had I been an imperfect vegan. Okay, this part might sound counterintuitive. And this is actually something my dad and I talked about. And I just want to expand on this point and what I mean. Like, I know maybe some of my vegan listeners who are listening are like, what, Lily? Like, you betrayed our community. What do you mean you're not going to be 100% vegan? And that's not what I mean. What I mean is I will still try to be as, vegan as I can in as many situations as I can. But there are times where I think it makes sense for me to be a little bit more flexible. And I will do that to maintain my relatability, because what I learned from all these Clubhouse discussions is that I would see my vegan friends get so passionate about animal rights and about climate activism, and I absolutely admire what they do and their intention behind it. But the way they conveyed the message, it actually ended up doing more harm than good, in the sense that it isolated them from everybody else and it alienated them from the meat eaters and everyone else who was not a vegan. And I think that's actually detrimental to the cause, right? When you stand firmly by your philosophy to the point where you make other people feel guilty for not standing behind your cause, I think that actually alienates you and it excludes others from your cause, which discourages them from having an adequate understanding of veganism. So I think by being an imperfect vegan and still occasionally indulge in dairy and egg when the option for veganism is impossible, that shows my friends who are not vegans that I am still human and that I am accepting of their way of life, and I'm not condemning them, right? I'm just trying to do the best that I can. And so that's what I meant when I said going forward, I might adopt a more flexible view when it comes to veganism. And also when it comes to other people, I think when I first started off as a vegan, like I said, I just wanted everyone to go vegan. And I said this in episode 2. And I was really frustrated and I was angry. I was like, why isn't the world vegan? It only makes sense that we go plant-based, because having learned about the cruelty behind animal agriculture, right? Like just the amount of hormones and steroids we inject into these animals crammed in tight cages, and we bring billions of them into this world only to slaughter them within days. Like the level of brutality involved is absolutely atrocious. And I still see that. Like that's not something I can unsee. However, I thought about it like this, right? So I think if I can get more people to reduce their meat and dairy and egg consumption, even just by like, let's say 30% on average, but I am able to impact, let's say 1,000 people, that's still way more effective than me being a super strict vegan. What I'm trying to say is, I think I will actually have a bigger impact when it comes to my work if I were 95% vegan versus 100% vegan, just because as an imperfect vegan, I am able to relate to a lot more people that are not vegan, including omnivores, including my friends who are meat eaters, who are vegetarians. I think me being imperfect retains that relatability, which makes them more receptive to my messaging, if that makes sense. And that is not to like find excuses for myself. Like I said, I will still keep myself in check as much as possible, but if I can be honest, I do feel this immense pressure from the vegan community, which I feel it every day, and it's a lot, right? And especially after I told all my friends, like, I've gone vegan, and now the expectation is that every time I go out, they expect me to only eat vegan food, that I never wear leather, or like, things like that. Like, I feel like that expectation, I put it upon myself, and they're gonna check me for that. And I just realized, well, shit, because like I said, we live in an imperfect world. Ideally, we would live in a world where there's vegan options at every restaurant. Like grocery stores would prioritize that, but the reality is we don't live in a perfect world, and we don't yet have the adequate infrastructure. Like our agriculture industry isn't equipped to, serve a vegan population yet. So, and that's not to say I'm not pushing for progress, but I'm saying while the world is still imperfect, we need some time for us to transition into a fully plant-based future. And in the meanwhile, I want to remain relatable as an activist first and foremost, so that I can deliver my message in a more meaningful and effective manner. So it's frustrating. And I know for my vegan listeners who are listening, like, you may be disappointed in me, in which case I apologize. I am sorry that I decided to take the stance, but I think it's what makes the most sense for me. And like I said, I still stand behind the cause very, very much, because like I said, I watched so many documentaries on animal agriculture, on climate change. These are things that I cannot possibly unlearn. And this is why I decided to become an activist, right? But I'm just simply pivoting my strategy a little bit. And, there are days where I think about these things too. I'm like, why are vegans so hated on for doing the right thing? Even though us vegans, we have the highest standards of ethics and morality, and yet somehow society ridicules us for upholding ourselves to the highest standards of ethics. Like, it makes no sense. It feels almost as if that we are being punished for being good people who value the lives of animals. Like, it makes no sense, that when you're doing the right thing and you're being like tormented and prosecuted for it, like, it just makes no sense. But yeah, that is, unfortunately, that is the current state of society. So I think, as a vegan, I constantly think about, okay, I do want to see this paradigm shift in society where we shift to a plant-based future, but that isn't there yet. And when I talk to my meat eater friends, my family who still eats meat, who are very opposed to my diet, who thinks I'm an absolute radical, how can I make them more receptive to my messaging of going plant-based? And that's what I really think about, right? Like, I think about it always in terms of my impact. Like, if I really care about the environment, I really care about the animals, and which I do, how can I amplify my overall impact. If me being an imperfect vegan, and I can somehow get 10 friends and family members to reduce their meat and dairy consumption by 30%, that's more meaningful than me being a super strict vegan, 100% vegan, and only being able to relate to like one other person in the room who's already vegan. Like, then I'm not really scaling up my impact, if that makes sense. So yeah, that was just my rant. And in the past year, I've learned from so many other vegans, and I am absolutely humbled. And I kind of witnessed the different stages of veganism, right? Like starting off as a novice, and then you become a little bit more experienced, and then all the way to a veteran. Let's say people who have been vegan for 10, 20 years, and I absolutely admire them. And I always wonder to myself, like, for all the other vegans in the world, have they ever, like secretly, like ate a piece of cheese or whatever here and there, or like blundered? Like, I'm sure that happens, right? Maybe they feel guilty afterward. They're like, oh, I wish no one found out. But I want to normalize that. I want to normalize imperfections in veganism, because I just feel like the community, I hate to say it, it is so critical. And not even because vegans want to be critical of one another. That's just kind of this toxic atmosphere that we built up due to the nature of, I guess, because as vegans we have such high standards of ethics for ourselves. Unfortunately, that becomes a double-edged sword, right? When we're in this community, we want to be supportive of other vegans, but at the same time, we sometimes become overly critical of others, and that's something I really dislike, and I no longer want to subscribe to that. So this is why I said, going forward, I'm going to be a 95% vegan instead of 100% vegan. And yes, it is a difficult decision to make, but I think it's what makes the most sense. So that means, yes, going forward, I will occasionally eat eggs, and if I go out and there are no vegan options, I might take the vegetarian option, which might contain traces of cheese and honey and whatever. I think the intention behind going plant-based is way more powerful than the actual precision of my execution with which, like, okay, I have to make sure there's not a single droplet of honey in my oat milk latte. Like, I think that is trivial, and that is missing the point of veganism. I don't think, as this vegan activist, Colleen Patrick Goudreau, someone I really admire and look up to, eloquently put, she said, veganism is not an end, veganism is a means to an end. And if we focus on the triviality of things, then we're missing out on the whole point. And another thing I want to talk about is, me recognizing my privilege as a vegan living in a Western democracy, right? Like, me having the purchasing power and the financial independence to be able to afford a vegan diet, whereas in many parts of the world, in developing countries, they might not nearly have as many options when it comes to access to vegan and plant-based food, right? Because if you really think about it, like meat and eggs and dairy, I guess these are more nutrient dense compared to plant-based alternatives. Like, when I live in a first world country, and of course, like, I have listeners that are gonna say, well, but what about tofu? Tofu is way cheaper than meat. You're absolutely right, but I think a lot of people want some variety in their diet, right? And with tofu, it just seems a little bit lacking in variety, and people are gonna say, well, when you live in a third world country, meat is just so much more nutrient dense, and it keeps me full. And if you eat like plant-based diet and with tofu, like, you're gonna get hungry. And I get that whole argument, but like, when you live in North America, there's so many other options, like Beyond Meat and Impossible Food, and like meat alternatives, and like fake meat and vegan sausages and cheese and whatnot. Like, all these luxuries that we have, right, that are not available to people living in developing countries. So just recognizing that privilege, that going vegan, unfortunately, given global inequality, is still very much a privilege that I get to enjoy as someone who is speaking from a position of privilege. So this is why nowadays, when I speak to people who are not vegan, I no longer question, like, oh, why are you not a vegan, and why are you not going plant-based when you should be? I would say that, the Western liberal democracies should take the lead on making the transition to a plant-based diet. Yes, because we're privileged, because we have the capacity to do so, and because we emit most of the emissions in the world compared to all the other poorer nations, we should shoulder that responsibility and we should take the lead on going plant-based and significantly reduce our meat and dairy consumption. But for all the other nations who are still struggling economically, they should do the best that they can to at least cut back or reduce their meat and dairy consumption, right? But, you know, for nations like Japan who depend on fish as a staple, and also in Latin America, unfortunately, that's still the case. Like, they might depend on cattle. It's going to be harder for them to make that transition. And that's not to say that we shouldn't make that transition. We absolutely should, and we should accelerate the transition. But I'm saying maybe we should have different standards for each nation. And for those of us who live in North America, especially me living in Canada, I do have the privilege to go vegan. I should do that, right? So it's about everybody doing the best that they can. So I think nowadays I'm no longer so much, obsessed with the idea of proselytizing every meat eater into a vegan, but rather, spreading the message that it's more important to reduce your meat and dairy consumption than to go like fully vegan and only eat like lentil salad for lunch. So yeah, and this is a concept that, this is something that my dad and I have talked about a lot, because like I said, we did get into this argument the other day where he was like, Lily, I really want you to think about it. Like, you can go about your vegan ways and you can follow this really quote unquote extreme lifestyle. Now, I disagree with his use of terminology there, but he said, you can be the super radical extreme vegan and only live in a tiny echo chamber where you only talk to other vegans, or you can be an imperfect vegan and occasionally eat meat and dairy and whatnot, and be able to appeal to a larger population. And because of your larger reach, you're able to impact more people that way and have an overall greater net impact. And I thought about it, right? Like, in the beginning I was very defensive, but then kind of took some time to ponder on what he said, and it made a lot of sense to me. So personally, I'm still not going to eat meat unless there's like absolutely no option and I need to eat meat for survival, then I will. But given the option to be plant-based, like I said, I will still do my best to adopt a vegan diet, but I'm not going to be as strict, and I'm not going to guilt myself if I ever go out and there's not a vegan option and I end up taking the vegetarian one with cheese and like a drizzle of honey or whatnot. Like, I'm just gonna recognize that I live in an imperfect world. The same reasoning goes for I cannot completely phase out of plastic. I want to. Ideally, if I lived in a perfect world, I would never ever have to buy anything that comes in plastic packaging ever again. But because I live in an imperfect world and the infrastructure is built in such a way that it is impossible for me to avoid plastic use, yes, I will still buy products that come in a plastic container, not because I want to, but because there are no viable alternatives. So while we work on that and we search for those alternatives, and I'm going to monitor my plastic use and try to minimize it as much as I can, bring my water bottles, opt for compostable containers and sustainable choices. I would do that as much as I can, but just recognizing that the world is imperfect, I'm going to focus on doing the best that I can instead of becoming like super preoccupied with the actual outcome. So I think the intention matters more than, like I said, the result in this case. So it's going to be a lifelong journey for me as a vegan activist and as a climate activist. And I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to call myself a vegan after this episode. I might get emails from listeners who say, hey Lily, you're no longer allowed to call yourself a vegan if you're not a vegan 100% of the time. Then maybe I'll be forced to abandon the title. Maybe some people would challenge me and say, why are you still calling yourself Make Peace Not Beef, calling the podcast that, if you occasionally eat whatever, eggs, dairy? And you know what? They can say whatever they want. I'm still going to continue to spread the message of reducing meat, dairy, and egg consumption because I believe in it, because I believe in a cruelty-free world, because I believe in reducing the environmental impact of animal agriculture, because I believe that we should put an end to deforestation, knowing that cattle farming is the leading driving cause of that. I've researched the facts and I still stand by my philosophy, but if anyone wants to challenge me, by all means. And I'm willing to stand by what I said. So yeah, this was a very emotionally wrenching episode. Not that emotionally wrenching, but it's a difficult realization that I've come to terms with, and I just want to be open and honest with you all about how I feel about this. And I think that at the end of the day, vegan or not vegan, like, I am a human being first and foremost. You know, the moment that I became vegan, I feel like so many people started to look at me differently, and they think somehow I belong to a different species now because I started identifying as vegan. But I just want to say that I am a human being first and foremost. And as a human being, of course I can relate to people who still eat meat. Of course I can relate to vegetarians. Of course I can relate to everybody else. Like, we're all human beings, and I will never be able to forget, you know, the thing that unifies all of us, right? And we're all in it for the same mission. And I'm sure even meat eaters and vegetarians and you know, because like I said, the vegan community tends to be a little bit exclusionary and a little bit overcritical. Like, no one wants to cause animals harm on purpose, right? It's either due to lack of information or that, or just like overall general ignorance, because, you know, the media doesn't always disclose that information, or like I said, a personal choice due to lack of viable alternatives that people choose to eat meat and vegetarian. But that is ultimately, I respect that as a personal choice, and I'm not going to force it upon other people to go vegan. So that is to say, I'm going to wrap this episode up that going forward, yes, I still identify as a vegan, but I'm going to be a little bit more flexible in my approach. And I want to make sure that I stay relatable as an imperfect human being first and foremost, so that I can have a bigger impact on the people around me in the world. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, Peacemakers. I really appreciate your understanding, and if you have any questions about my views, or if you want to talk to me or ask me any questions, you know, you can reach me on Instagram at LilyTong, or that's my personal account, or at MakePeaceNotBeef. And of course, you can come and talk to me on Clubhouse. My handle is lily.tom, and you can also comment on my YouTube channel and things like that. You're welcome to also email me. It's lily@makepeacenotbeef.com. I'm happy to chat with you on why I decided to adopt a more flexible stance. So yeah, thank you so much for listening, and good to be back. And I hope you continue to support my podcast. I will continue to spread the word around, you know, plant-based diet and also climate action, as I still firmly believe in both. So I just want to thank you for your understanding, and I hope to speak to you soon. All right, talk to you later. Bye.